Hi y'all, welcome to Mike Peace Woodturning. Do you have a particular tool that's just not working for you? I'm not talking about lacking basic turning skills, but I'm talking about maybe the shape or the profile. It just is not working for you. It doesn't match your style of wood turning. Perhaps you've got a tool just gathering dust that if you change the bevel, change the profile, or repurpose it, you're going to get more use out of it. Now, if you're a brand new wood turner, this video may contain some content that you're just not ready for. This is not a video about basic sharpening technique, and I'm not encouraging you to start changing the bevel angles or grinds on all your tools willy-nilly. Sometimes when you're learning, you just got to kind of maintain the course. I've seen more than one wood turning demonstrator that extolling the particular virtues of a particular grind or angle on a bowl gouge, for example. But if you've got basic tool turning techniques, you're not getting a lot of catches, maybe it's time to experiment with one or more of your tools to see if you've got a new grind that's going to work better for you. But remember, a sharp tool is more important than the particular bevel that it's ground at. So when should you change a grind on a tool? Well, there's four basic times. Number one, when the factory grind is just not right for you. Secondly, there was a screw up on the tool. Perhaps it's one you picked up secondhand at a flea market or garage sale, and it's got a strange grind on it. It just doesn't work for you, and it probably didn't work for the previous owner as well. Thirdly, it's to change the purpose of the particular tool. And lastly, as I mentioned before, an opportunity to experiment. Let's look at each one of these in a little more detail. So the first time that you might want to make a change when it comes from the factory in a basic profile that just is not suited for you. After all, the factory doesn't know what kind of profile you want, and there is no universal profile that will fit everybody. Why should they spend money doing a more sophisticated grind that takes a little extra time, like a swept back or Irish grind or an Ellsworth grind, when maybe what you want is a 40-40 grind, and if so, you need to change it. Or maybe you want to make a very short, steep bevel on it for a bottom feeder bowl gouge, and you're just going to wind up grinding away a swept back profile they put on it. So there's an example when it's time to make a change, when it comes from the factory in a manner that just doesn't suit you. It's not wrong, it just doesn't suit you. The second time is when somebody really screwed up the grind. You know, they put an extreme point on a tool that doesn't need a point. They've got a profile on it that is just so extremely blunt or extremely sharp that it just doesn't work, and it needs fixing. Maybe it's got they've got big gaps in the front, bird beak, because they were grinding away near the thin edge of the tool and just didn't know what they were doing. Under the category of coming from a factory in an unusable format is this bodger Bedan that came with one side was parallel and the other side was at an angle the way it should have been, which, you know, is a strange, bizarre situation. But anyway, I reground it to give it a profile more suitable for as a Bedan. So the third time to change is when you want to repurpose the tool. In its current configuration, it just doesn't do what you want to do. You've got a scraper that you want to turn into a special purpose tool, for example. And the last one is one I mentioned before. You've got some pretty good tool competencies, and you just want to maybe experiment with a different grind. So some of the questions you need to ask yourself before you start making changes on a particular tool grind or profile is it broke and does it need fixing? Or can you improve it? Is it a tool you do not currently have a need for in its current configuration, but you might in the future, in which case put it back in the drawer and don't mess with it. You've got to ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish? Do you have a need for a particular shape or grind and have a spare tool that can be repurposed? Is it a tool that you want to experiment with? Perhaps you've got more than one skew and you've been satisfied with a traditional 40 degree included angle, but you're kind of curious and you've got more than one skew. Would you be better off with a 30 degree on that project where you'll be turning a lot of pine balusters, for example? Perhaps you watched one of Richard Raffin's videos where he was demonstrating his asymmetrical grind, where it's got a short acute bevel on one side and a swept back grind on the other. Perhaps you got several scrapers and you want to you want to experiment from maybe converting it from a conventional to a negative rake, or from a spear point to a shear scraper. If you think it'll work for you, go for it. Perhaps it's as simple as putting a bevel angle on the front of a thin parting tool in order to stiffen up and reduce the chatter vibration from the tip by making it a stronger tool. And by also doing so, it lifts the cutting edge so it's going to be closer to the edge of the gouge you might have been using before or after, therefore reducing the need to adjust your tool rest to get your tool at the appropriate height. A common need for improvement are various skews that have a very, very sharp edge, so when you're taking a planing cut, it's coming along, and if you get any dig-ins, you're going to cause dig-ins into your cast iron tool rest that comes with most lathes. This is real common on inexpensive, cheap Chinese tools, such as this set by Harbor Freight that I had to do some work on both of the skews, but I've also seen it in more expensive skews from more quality manufacturers, the likes of Robert Sorby, where the edges were so sharp they would almost cut you. It makes it completely unsuitable for use until you did some work on it. We'll talk about what work it needs in just a moment. This large Allen lacer skew has a very rounded bottom that enables it to very smoothly, easily glide over the tool rest when you're turning without any dig in, because it doesn't have sharp edges. Now on the top, it's just got the edge is what they call air. It's just knocked back a little bit because typically when you flip it over to use a toe, you're going to use that frequently for a V cut, so you want it to be able to be fully supported and not on a rounded edge. So that's a very nice shape. So that's the shape that I improved or fixed my cheap Harbor Freight that had very sharp edges. I knocked the edges off as shown in this picture using sandpaper for this slight edge, and for the larger edge on the bottom where it needed round over, I did this on a belt sander. This is not something you could easily do on a grinder. You'd want to use a belt sander for this. A belt sander on this edge would be too aggressive, and that's where just the sandpaper works. Now it's an 80 grit belt sander, so I'm going to polish it up a little bit with a little 240 where I rounded it over. Another example for potential improvement on a skew might be the profile. Here's this radius profile that comes with the large 1 3/8 inch Allen lacer skew. Why would you prefer this over this? Well, I'm not going to go into all the details. I've got a video on the skew that talks more about details, but perhaps that you've got more than one skew and you don't have this kind of profile. But the quick answer is the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But if you're cutting in the lower third, you've got a little larger sweet spot if you've got a curve. So for some people, for some technique, this may be an improvement. For others, not so much so. But it's another opportunity for either improving the shape or experimenting. Anyone that uses a skew quite a bit knows that there are more than two edges to sharpen. It's just not this side and reverse, but you also sharpen this side and this side. That can be problematic with a tool that comes from a round bar, such as this one by Carter or this one by Jet that's got a very rounded surface. What that means is you can't get as clean a cut right down here if you're cutting along this edge unless you take it to the grinder and kind of nip it flat. So there's an opportunity for improvement. Another example of improving the basic grind, it's not as clear on this spindle roughing gouge as it is on some, but some of them, this part here is completely rounded over, and that makes it much more difficult to come right into a shoulder and cut with this entire edge, because if it's rounded, you're not going to get a sharp edge right here. Just nipping the corners flat on a grinder can be an improvement if that's how you use your spindle roughing gouge. Some turners, such as Richard Raffin and the late Ray Key, used a asymmetrical grind where they'd have one grind at one angle on the right side and maybe a swept back on the left. I don't know whether this would fall under improvement or experiment. It depends on what's your preference for sharpening. If you use a veer grind, you cannot do an asymmetrical grind. I prefer the convenience of the veer grind jig because I never quite mastered the sharpening freehand using a platform, and I came close to it, but this was just more convenient to me. But that's a thought. A common area for improvement on virtually every bowl gouge is having the heel taken back. I've never seen a bowl gouge from the manufacturer that had the heel, this corner, sharp corner ground back. There's a couple of purposes. When you're coming around like this, it gives you a little more clearance to continue to ride the bevel on the cutting edge as opposed to bouncing off this sharp edge, which can leave sometimes ripples that don't even show up after sanding until you put a finish on it. Here's an, I've got a little bit of a grind back here, and here's a picture of another example where the bevel's been ground back on the bowl gouge. I put a micro bevel on basically all of my gouges, and I guess you'd say this would fall in the area of improvement in order to minimize the rubbing in the back or the bruising of the wood as you come around a corner. It just makes for a better grind on virtually every gouge. In this video I'm generally talking about grinding steel, but here's while I've got this, a quick example of an improvement on a lot of tool handles is just hit it with your belt sander to have a flat. So there you can put your name on it, but it also keeps it flat and less likely to roll off of a table or your lathe bed. I don't know whether you'd call this coming from the factory in a less than usable form for you or an improvement, but I took a Benjamin Best 5/8 inch bowl gouge to repurpose it by changing the profile dramatically to a bottom feeder, which is a fairly steep grind, and a not using a jig but doing it on a platform, so it didn't have much of a sweep back. I guess one comment here is that I'm not primarily a bowl turner and could not justify paying more than $100 for a 5/8 inch or a 3/4 inch bowl gouge as a dedicated one-trick pony as a bottom feeder. So I bought this Benjamin's Best for less than 1/3 of a quality tool. Is it as good? No, of course not. But a universal truth is that if it's sharp, it will cut. It might take a few more trips back to the sharpener, but it meets my needs. And another improvement on this tool is I added a 17-inch handle so I would have more leverage or a larger ratio of handle to the part over the tool rest. When you reach into a bowl, you need that 5-to-1 ratio, so this gives me that ratio for the type of bowls that I typically turn. Here's a great example of a repurposed tool. I used a cheap Harbor Freight 1-inch skew that had no value to me because I had a better 1-inch skew, and I turned it into a spear point, rounded over the sides so it would glide easily, put a good sized bevel on it, and use this. I still use this as a shear scraper because I can use this side and this side. Since then I have made a different shear scraper along the lines of something that Richard Raffin uses, with a rounding over the edge and making a sharp corner here. This is a little bit thicker. It's a little bit wider. It's got a slight profile on it, and it works better for most shear scraping because I have less vibration up here at the top. But then I use this one still from time to time when I need to get into an area or go in the other direction. Here's an example of a tool I repurposed. This was a cheap Harbor Freight scraper or point tool or spear point or something. I don't even remember. But I put an angle on the front and the back, changed the, have a bevel on the front and back. And this was basically used, I used this as a dedicated box scraper. And it worked just fine. It was a conventional grind until I was able to replace it when I was able to pick up this tool from an estate sale at half price. Clearly the Sorby tool is a better quality tool, and it's a little bit thicker, it's a little bit wider, but this tool met my needs at the time. Again, another repurposed tool from a cheap Harbor Freight Chinese high-speed steel, not the best, but I was able to turn it into a dovetail or recess scraper, which I rarely use, so I couldn't justify going out and buying one. Plus, this design that I got from Marc Soleil is much more functional than any one that's on the market. Okay, let me show you this in operation. You can see with the tailstock up, I've still got an opportunity to get in sideways. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to come into the side, And we're just going to, it's a scraper, just come on back. Here's another example of a tool I repurposed. This is a tool made in Sheffield, England, a quality tool. The original profile looked something like this Hamlet side scraper, which I never found any use for, and this tool came with my original used setup of a jet mini lathe and an odd bunch of tools. So regrinding it makes it much more useful for me to undercut the lip of a box, or when I need a smaller scraper. Another one I did, I repurposed similar to that, but I turned it into a negative rake, and that's from a Harbor Freight tool, and I use this a lot for a similar purpose than this, sometimes for smaller tools, and also when I need a slightly less aggressive tool, because it is a negative rake, which means I don't have to be quite as concerned about lifting the handle. I can keep it flat, whereas this one you need to raise the handle a little bit because it's a conventional scraper. I changed the profile of a number of scrapers I had. I don't know whether you this falls in the category of an improvement or an experiment, but I used these for several years, and they've served very useful purpose. I had a couple of these from Penn State, Benjamin Best, and oddly enough, I changed them both to negative scrapers. But now, after watching so many of Richard Raffin's videos and his skillful use of a conventional scraper, I've actually reconverted this one back to a conventional scraper. And you may be familiar with the D-Way beating tool. It's a very nice tool. It's not inexpensive. I repurposed a couple of tools to get for similar functionality from a couple of absolutely useless, very poor quality spindle gouges from Harbor Freight, 1¼ inch and 1 3/8. But I don't use these very often, and I don't know whether you call this an improvement or repurpose or an experiment. I've got a separate video on these if you're interested on the link above.
All right, let me just discuss a few quick tips on changing some of these, repurposing some of these tools. More details are in the long form video, but if you're cutting flat stock such as chisels and scrapers, you might be a lot better off with an angle grinder instead of grinding it all on a grinder.
So I've got to round this over so it'll slide along the tool rest easily, so I will round over the back, and I'll just caress this so it won't be quite so sharp. Now it's an 80 grit belt sander, so I'm going to polish it up a little bit with a little 240 where I rounded it over. Okay. I keep an old aluminum oxide wheel in case I'm sharpening something other than tool steel, such as high-speed steel. But mostly I like to do my reshaping on an 80 grit CBN wheel. I prefer the 80 to a 180 for regrinding and repurposing, but the 180 could work. You don't have to be too concerned about bluing high-speed steel. If you press too hard, it might discolor it, but it's not going to. You're not going to ruin the edge on high-speed steel on a grinder. I think using a protractor like this, you can pick this up at big box home development stores or pick it up on my Amazon shop. Very handy for evaluating the angles or setting an angle. Another trick that's very helpful is one of these digital angle gauges. You can set this platform wherever you want it. If you repurposed, reground a tool to get a new life out of it, share it in the notes below. And remember, y'all stay safe and come on back, you hear?